The Whig Party elected 2 presidents, controlled Congress, and unified the North and the South for 20 years. Then it vanished in less than 4 years. Its collapse didn't just end a political party, it ended the last institution that forced North and South to cooperate. Without the Whigs holding the center, America split into irreconcilable sections, and 620,000 died because of it. In 1833, America didn't need another political party. The Democratic Republicans had dominated for decades. James Monroe's presidency, 1817 to 1825, was called the Era of Good Feelings, precisely because political opposition had evaporated. Then came Andrew Jackson. Elected in 1828 and re-elected in 1832, Jackson transformed the presidency from a modest office into an imperial throne. His enemies called him King Andrew I, and they weren't entirely joking. Jackson concentrated executive power in unprecedented ways. He used the veto more than all previous presidents combined, not just for unconstitutional laws, but for policies he simply disagreed with. He ignored the Supreme Court when it ruled against his Indian removal policies, allegedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Most explosively, Jackson destroyed the Second Bank of the United States, the central bank that stabilized the economy and provided credit. He called it a corrupt monopoly serving wealthy elites. His opponents called it economic suicide. When South Carolina tried to nullify federal tariff laws in 1832, Jackson threatened to invade the state and hang the nullifiers. He forced South Carolina to back down, but his willingness to use federal military power against a state terrified states' rights advocates. Jackson's enemies were diverse and mutually contradictive. National Republicans like Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams believed in an active federal government, internal improvements, roads and canals, protective tariffs, and the national bank. Jackson opposed all of it. Southern states' rights advocates like John C. Calhoun, until he broke with Jackson, hated federal power and tariffs. They loved Jackson's Democratic Party initially, until they realized Jackson would use federal force against them. Anti-Masons, a bizarre political movement that emerged from conspiracy theories about Freemasonry controlling American politics. Jackson was a prominent Mason. Therefore, the anti-Masons opposed him fanatically. Northern industrialists and merchants depended on protective tariffs, the national bank, and a stable currency. Jackson's economic policies threatened their businesses. Southern planters who needed credit and hated Jackson's use of federal power, even though many initially supported him. This coalition made no sense ideologically. States' rights, Southerners, and nationalist Northerners, wealthy bankers and frontier populists, anti-Masonic conspiracy theorists, and pragmatic politicians. The only thing they agreed on, Andrew Jackson must be stopped. In 1834, they formally organized as the Whig Party. The name was deliberately chosen, carrying 2 meanings. First, British Whigs had historically opposed monarchical power and defended parliamentary rights. American Whigs positioned themselves as defenders of legislative authority against King Andrew's executive tyranny. Second, American Revolution patriots who opposed British rule had called themselves Whigs. The party was claiming the revolutionary legacy, ironically, against Jackson, who styled himself a man of the people and a champion of democracy. The Whig coalition was held together by opposition, not vision. Henry Clay tried to articulate the American system, protective tariffs, a national bank, and federal funding for internal improvements. But Southern Whigs hated tariffs and federal spending. Northern Whigs loved them. The party's leaders were giants. Henry Clay, the great compromiser from Kentucky, Daniel Webster, Massachusetts senator and perhaps the greatest orator in American history. William Henry Harrison, war hero. Thurlow Weed and William Seward, both from New York, were master political operators, but they couldn't agree on a platform. In the 1836 election, the Whigs ran 3 different regional candidates: Harrison in the North and West, Hugh Lawson White in the South, and Daniel Webster in New England, hoping to throw the election to the House of Representatives. It failed. Jackson's chosen successor, Martin Van Buren, won easily. The Whigs learned a crucial lesson. They couldn't win on policy. Americans didn't want to hear about banking policy and internal improvements. Those issues were boring and divisive. So in 1840, they tried something revolutionary, running on nothing at all. The Whigs nominated William Henry Harrison again, now an elderly war hero with almost no political record. For vice president, they chose John Tyler, a Virginia states' rights Democrat who'd broken with Jackson. The campaign was pure spectacle. Tippecanoe and Tyler too, referencing Harrison's minor military victory. Log cabin imagery, even though Harrison came from a wealthy family. Hard cider, campaign songs, parades, massive rallies. No platform, no policy promises. When asked about issues, Whig campaigners sang louder. Democrats were baffled. They ran on actual governance, Van Buren's record, economic policy, and political philosophy. The Whigs ran on vibes. The voters chose vibes. Harrison won decisively. The Whig coalition had captured the presidency through pure image politics and anti-Jackson sentiment. They'd proven a purely negative coalition could win elections. But they'd also proven they had no idea what to do with power. Because on April 4th, 1841, precisely 31 days after taking office, William Henry Harrison died of pneumonia, possibly contracted during his lengthy inaugural address delivered in cold rain without a coat. And suddenly, the presidency belonged to John Tyler. The man the Whigs had chosen purely for regional balance, a states' rights Virginian who disagreed with nearly every Whig policy, was now president. Tyler immediately vetoed Whig legislation to recharter the national bank. He vetoed tariff increases. He opposed internal improvements. The Whigs were apoplectic. They'd elected their own enemy. Henry Clay and the Whig Congressional Caucus formally expelled Tyler from the party. Tyler's entire cabinet resigned in protest, except Secretary of State Daniel Webster, who stayed to finish negotiating a treaty with Britain. Tyler became the president without a party. And the Whigs became a party that didn't control the presidency they'd won. The coalition that had formed to oppose Jackson discovered that opposition alone wasn't enough. Negative partisanship could win elections, but couldn't govern. And the cracks in the Whig coalition, papered over by shared hatred of Jackson, were already showing. The question that would destroy the party was emerging. What do you do about slavery? The Whigs had no answer, and avoiding the question would kill them. The 1840 presidential campaign was American politics' first great con job. The Whigs had a problem. Their actual policies were unpopular or divisive. Henry Clay's American system, national bank, protective tariffs, federally funded infrastructure, thrilled industrialists and terrified farmers. States' rights positions pleased Southerners and horrified Northerners. So the Whigs made a brilliant decision: run on nothing. William Henry Harrison was the perfect empty vessel. At 67, he was old enough that his political positions were vague and outdated. His primary qualification was military heroism. He'd defeated Tecumseh's Confederation at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 and fought in the War of 1812. That was enough. war heroes didn't need policy positions. The Whigs built the entire campaign around image and emotion, not issues. They stole the strategy from Jackson's campaigns, but perfected it into high art. When a Democratic newspaper mockingly suggested Harrison would be content to sit in a log cabin drinking hard cider rather than run the country, the Whigs embraced it enthusiastically. Never mind that Harrison was born into Virginia aristocracy and lived in a comfortable estate. The log cabin became the campaign symbol. Campaign rallies featured actual log cabins on wheels, rolled through towns. Hard cider flowed freely. Whig newspapers published endless verses of campaign songs. Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, became the most famous. But there were hundreds more. Van is a used-up man. With Tip and Tyler, we'll burst Van's Beeler. Rallies attracted tens of thousands, unprecedented numbers. One gathering in Ohio drew an estimated 100,000 people to a state with only 900,000 total residents. These weren't political meetings. They were festivals, entertainment, community celebrations. The Democrats tried to compete with substance. President Martin Van Buren's campaign published detailed defenses of his economic policies, his response to the Panic of 1837, and his political philosophy. Voters didn't care. They wanted log cabins and cider. The Whigs even weaponized Van Buren's actual presidency against him. They portrayed him as an effete aristocrat who ate from gold plates, false, while ordinary people suffered. Never mind that Harrison was wealthier, the image was what mattered. Demographic turnout was staggering. 80% of eligible voters, adult white males, cast ballots, up from 58% in 1836. The Whig spectacle had turned politics into mass entertainment, mobilizing voters who'd never cared about banking policy. Harrison won decisively, 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60. He carried 19 of 26 states. But the coalition that elected him was fundamentally contradictory. Northern Whigs had voted for protective tariffs and national banking. Southern Whigs had voted for states' rights and limited government. Western Whigs wanted cheap land and internal improvements. Harrison's inaugural address tried to please everyone by saying almost nothing. At 8,445 words, the longest inaugural in history, delivered in freezing rain without a coat, it droned through vague platitudes about Republican virtue and constitutional balance. Then Harrison caught pneumonia. He died exactly 1 month later, April 4th, 1841. John Tyler became president, and the Whig Party's contradictions exploded. Tyler was a Virginia aristocrat, a states' rights ideologue who'd broken with Jackson not over policy, but over Jackson's use of federal power against South Carolina. Tyler opposed nearly everything the Whig Party actually stood for. The Whigs had chosen him purely for regional balance, to prove the party wasn't just Northern industrialists. They never imagined he'd actually become president. Henry Clay, the real power in the Whig Party, assumed that Tyler would be a figurehead while Clay, as Senate leader, would drive policy. Clay immediately pushed legislation to recharter the national bank. Tyler vetoed it. Clay was stunned. He revised the bill, removing Tyler's stated objections. Tyler vetoed it again. The Whig Congressional Caucus was apoplectic. They'd won the presidency specifically to recharter the bank. Now their own president was blocking them. Clay pushed through tariff legislation. Tyler vetoed it. Internal improvements funding. Vetoed. On September 11, 1841, just 5 months into Tyler's presidency, the entire Whig cabinet resigned in protest, except Secretary of State Daniel Webster, who stayed to finish treaty negotiations with Britain. 2 days later, The Whig Congressional Caucus formally expelled Tyler from the party. Tyler became His Excellency, a president without a party. He tried to build a third party around himself. It went nowhere. He finished his term isolated and impotent, achieving almost nothing. But Tyler's betrayal revealed the Whig Party's core weakness. The coalition was held together only by opposition to Jackson. Once Jackson was gone, the shared enemies that created the party disappeared. What remained were incompatible factions with contradictory goals. Northern Whigs wanted an activist federal government, industrial protection, and moral reform. Many were becoming anti-slavery. Southern Whigs wanted a limited federal government, agricultural interests protected, and slavery left alone. Western Whigs wanted cheap land, infrastructure, and expansion. These groups couldn't all get what they wanted. Compromise was possible on banking and tariffs. Those were negotiable policy differences. But slavery was emerging as the issue that couldn't be compromised. And the Whigs, having formed as a coalition specifically avoiding ideological coherence, had no framework for resolving fundamental moral disagreements. For now, they avoided the slavery question by simply not discussing it. Whig leaders like Clay and Webster performed impressive rhetorical gymnastics to talk about everything except the thing that mattered most. This worked locally. Northern Whigs could be anti-slavery, Southern Whigs pro-slavery, as long as the National Party didn't take a position. But avoidance couldn't last forever. The territorial expansion of the 1840s, Texas annexation, Mexican War, Western territories, would force the slavery question into every political debate. And when it did, the Whig Party's foundational weakness, no coherent principle except opposition to Jackson, would kill it. The 1840 campaign had proven that spectacle and image could win elections. Log cabins and hard cider could mobilize voters. But governing required actual positions on actual issues. And the Whigs didn't have them. The contradictions were already fatal. They just didn't know it yet. Henry Clay saved the Union 3 times. Each time, he bought a few more years of peace. And each time, the compromise grew more complex, and the peace grew more fragile. Clay was born in Virginia in 1777, but made his fortune and political career in Kentucky, a border state that put him in a uniquely positioned to understand both the North and the South. He'd been Speaker of the House, Secretary of State, Senator, and perennial presidential candidate. He ran 5 times and lost every time. But his real talent wasn't winning elections, it was making deals. Clay understood something fundamental about American politics in the first half of the 19th century. The Union was held together by bargains, not principles. North and South had incompatible economies, cultures, and visions of America's future. The only thing preventing disunion was a series of carefully calibrated agreements in which both sides got enough to accept what they hated. Clay was the master of this transactional politics. His first great compromise was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, though he wasn't the sole architect. Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and Maine as a free state. Slavery was prohibited north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes line in the Louisiana Purchase territory. Both sides hated parts of it. Both sides accepted it because the alternative was worse. His second was the Tariff Compromise of 1833, which resolved the nullification crisis. South Carolina had threatened to nullify federal tariff laws, declaring them unconstitutional. Jackson had threatened military force. Clay brokered a deal, a gradual tariff reduction over 10 years in exchange for South Carolina accepting federal authority. The compromise prevented immediate civil war, but satisfied no one. Northern industrialists lost their protective tariffs. Southern radicals accepted federal power they detested, but it bought time. By the late 1840s, the slavery question was becoming impossible to avoid. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, added vast western territories. California, New Mexico, Utah, the modern Southwest, all had to be organized into territories and eventually states. Would they allow slavery? The North said no. The South said yes. And unlike tariffs or banking, this wasn't negotiable policy. It was a fundamental moral disagreement about whether human beings could be property. The fight erupted immediately. In 1846, Congressman David Wilmot, Pennsylvania, proposed the Wilmot Proviso, which prohibited slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. It passed the House repeatedly, but failed in the Senate every time. The nation was gridlocked. California was begging for statehood. The gold rush had brought enough settlers to qualify. But admitting California as a free state, which it would undoubtedly be, would give free states a Senate majority. The South threatened secession. Henry Clay, now 73 years old and in failing health, returned to the Senate in 1849 to attempt one final compromise. The Compromise of 1850 was actually 5 separate bills, each carefully calibrated to give something to both sections. For the North, California was admitted as a free state. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, was abolished in Washington. D.C. Texas's western boundary was defined, preventing it from expanding as a massive slave state. For the South, popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico territories let settlers decide on slavery. Stronger fugitive slave law, forcing northern states to return, escaped enslaved people. Texas received $10 million in federal money for debt assumption. The debates lasted 9 months. They were among the most dramatic in Senate history. Clay spoke for 2 days straight in February 1850, begging both sections to accept half measures to preserve the Union. I conjure gentlemen, whether from the South or the North, to pause at the edge of the precipice before the fearful and disastrous leap is taken into the yawning abyss below. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, dying of tuberculosis, sat wrapped in blankets while a colleague read his final speech rejecting compromise. The North must accept slavery's expansion, or the South would leave the Union. He died before the compromise passed. Daniel Webster, Clay's fellow Whig and Massachusetts senator, delivered his famous 7th of March speech supporting the compromise. Political suicide in anti-slavery Massachusetts, but Webster believed necessary to save the Union. President Zachary Taylor, a Whig, opposed the compromise. He wanted California admitted immediately without the other provisions. But Taylor died suddenly in July 1850, possibly from contaminated cherries and milk. His successor, Millard Fillmore, also a Whig, supported Clay's compromise. The young Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois took over managing the bills when Clay's health failed. Douglas's parliamentary maneuvering, breaking the omnibus bill into separate measures, finally got them passed in September 1850. Clay had won. The Union was saved, again. But the cost was devastating, particularly for the Whig Party. The Fugitive Slave Law was the poison pill. It required federal commissioners to return accused fugitives to slavery, denied accused runaways jury trials or the right to testify, and paid commissioners $10 if they ruled someone enslaved, but only $5 if they ruled them free. A financial incentive to enslave. Northern Whigs were horrified. Their constituents watched black neighbors, some free for decades, kidnapped off the streets and dragged south in chains. Federal power, which Whigs generally supported, was being used to enforce slavery. Southern Whigs demanded that Northern Whigs enforce the law. The Union depended on it. Any wavering was treason to the compromise. The Whig Party began splitting geographically. Conscience Whigs in the North opposed the fugitive slave law. Cotton Whigs supported it. Southern Whigs demanded absolute enforcement. Clay's compromise machine had worked one more time, but it had also revealed that the Whig Party, a coalition requiring North-South cooperation, couldn't survive when the slavery issue became central. Clay died in 1852, exhausted and disappointed. Webster died the same year. Calhoun was already dead. The great triumvirate that had dominated American politics for 3 decades was gone. The generation that remembered when compromise worked was dying. The next generation, Lincoln, Davis, Seward, Douglas, had no experience making sectional bargains work. They'd only seen compromise fail to resolve fundamental questions. The Compromise of 1850 brought 4 years of peace. But it was the last successful significant compromise, and it shattered the Whig Party in the process. The center could not hold because the center was Clay, and Clay was dead. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 radicalized the North in ways abolitionists never could. Before 1850, slavery was a Southern problem to most Northerners. Morally troubling, politically divisive, but distant. Something that happened somewhere else. The Fugitive Slave Act made slavery a Northern problem. It forced ordinary Northerners to participate in slavery's machinery, and they hated it. The law was brutally efficient. Any black person could be accused of being a runaway slave. Federal commissioners would hear the case without a jury, without allowing the accused to testify in their own defense. The commissioner would receive $10 if they ruled the person enslaved, $5 if they ruled them free. The law's supporters claimed this was just compensating for additional paperwork when returning someone to slavery. Critics noted it was a financial incentive to enslave people. Federal marshals were required to assist in the capture of fugitives accused of crimes. Citizens could be drafted into pauses to hunt runaways. Anyone who aided an escaped enslaved person faced $1,000 fines and 6 months in prison. The law turned every Northerner into a potential slave catcher, and many refused. In September 1850, the same month the law passed, Boston's black community rescued Shadrach Minkins from a courtroom and smuggled him to Canada. Federal authorities arrested his rescuers, but juries refused to convict. In Christiana, Pennsylvania, in September 1851, a Maryland enslaver named Edward Gorsuch came with federal marshals to recapture escaped enslaved people. Local black and white residents fought back. Gorsuch was killed. His son was wounded. The fugitives escaped to Canada. President Fillmore charged 38 people with treason. They were all acquitted. In Syracuse, New York, in October 1851, a fugitive named William Jerry Henry was rescued from a police station by an abolitionist mob and sent to Canada. Across the North, vigilance committees formed to warn black residents of slave catchers, hide fugitives, and physically resist arrests. These weren't radicals. These were ordinary Northerners watching their neighbors, people they'd lived alongside for years, kidnapped and enslaved based on accusations they couldn't legally challenge. The cases of free black people kidnapped into slavery were particularly horrifying. Solomon Northup's memoir, 12 Years a Slave, published 1853, described his kidnapping from New York and enslavement in Louisiana. The Fugitive Slave Act made such kidnappings easier because alleged fugitives couldn't testify or present evidence of their freedom. For the Whig Party, the Fugitive Slave Act was political poison. Northern Whigs faced furious constituents demanding they oppose the law. Southern Whigs faced equally furious constituents demanding strict enforcement. the party couldn't hold both positions. In Massachusetts, conscience Whigs like Charles Sumner bolted from the party entirely, forming coalitions with Free Soilers and anti-slavery Democrats. They viewed Daniel Webster, who'd supported the Fugitive Slave Act as part of the Compromise of 1850, as a traitor. Webster's political career ended in disgrace. In New York, William Seward, the state's Whig senator and future Lincoln Secretary of State, spoke against the Fugitive Slave Act, appealing to higher law than the Constitution. Southern Whigs called him a traitor to the party and the Union. Cotton Whigs, Northern business interests with Southern trade connections, supported enforcement to preserve sectional peace. They were electoral poison, carrying the stench of slavery to Northern voters. Southern Whigs, meanwhile, faced different pressure. They'd supported the Compromise of 1850 as a final settlement of the slavery question. But Southern voters were increasingly suspicious of any party with Northern members who questioned slavery. Southern Democrats attacked Whigs as insufficiently committed to slavery's defense. Fire-eaters like Robert Barnwell Rhett and William Lowndes Yancey demanded absolute Southern unity. Parties with Northern wings were inherently untrustworthy. The 1852 presidential election exposed the Whig Party's collapse. The Whigs nominated Winfield Scott, yet another elderly military hero with minimal political record. The strategy had worked for Harrison. Maybe it would work again. It didn't. Scott tried to avoid discussing slavery, which satisfied no one. Northern Whigs thought he was too soft on the Fugitive Slave Act. Southern Whigs thought he was too friendly with anti-slavery forces. The Democrats nominated Franklin Pierce, a handsome non-entity from New Hampshire, who enthusiastically supported the Fugitive Slave Act and appealed to Southern voters while being technically Northern. Pierce won in a landslide, 254 electoral votes to Scott's 42. Scott carried only 4 states: Massachusetts, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The Whig Party had gone from controlling the presidency and Congress in 1840 to near total collapse in 12 years. What happened? The Fugitive Slave Act revealed the party's fundamental weakness. It required North-South cooperation when North and South increasingly hated each other. The Whigs had worked when they could avoid taking positions on slavery. As long as slavery remained abstract or regional, Northern and Southern Whigs could coexist by focusing on tariffs, banking, and internal improvements. But the Fugitive Slave Act made slavery immediate and personal to Northerners. It forced Whigs to choose: enforce a law that enslaved people or defy federal authority and betray Southern Party members. Northern Whigs chose conscience over party unity. Southern Whigs chose slavery over party survival. After 1852, the Whig Party was dead in all but name. It would stumble through 2 more election cycles as a zombie. Animated by nostalgia and desperation, but fundamentally lifeless. The party still had prominent leaders. Abraham Lincoln was a Whig in Illinois. So was Salmon Chase in Ohio. Thaddeus Stevens in Pennsylvania. These men would soon become Republicans, but in 1852, they still called themselves Whigs. But the institutional party, the national organization that could coordinate campaigns, raise money, unite North and South, was finished. The question now was, what would replace it? Northern Whigs would need a new political home. Some would join the Republicans, forming around opposition to slavery's expansion. Others would join the Know-Nothings, a nativist movement that tried to unite Americans through hatred of immigrants instead of division over slavery. Southern Whigs would need a new home, too. Some would join the Democrats, the only remaining national party. Others would form constitutional union movements, desperately trying to preserve sectional peace through studied ignorance of the slavery question. But none of these alternatives could replicate what the Whigs had done: force ambitious politicians from both sections to cooperate, compromise, and prevent disunion. The Whigs' collapse didn't just end a political party. It ended the institutional mechanism that had prevented civil war for 40 years. And in 1854, the final blow would fall. Stephen Douglas thought he was being clever. Instead, he lit the fuse that destroyed the Whig Party and eventually the Union. Douglas was a Democrat, not a Whig, but his actions in 1854 delivered the death blow to the Whig coalition. Understanding why requires understanding his ambitions and his spectacular miscalculation. By 1854, Douglas was Illinois' senior senator, chairman of the Committee on Territories, and a leading presidential contender. He was brilliant, energetic, and ruthlessly pragmatic. Everything Henry Clay had been, but without Clay's commitment to preserving sectional peace above personal ambition. Douglas wanted two things: a transcontinental railroad running through Illinois, which would make him and his Chicago land investments enormously wealthy, and the presidency. Both required Southern support. Southern senators controlled key committees and could block railroad legislation. Southern Democrats would determine the party's presidential nomination. The problem was the territory between Illinois and California, the Great Plains region that would become Kansas and Nebraska. It needed to be organized into territories before railroad construction could proceed. But there was a complication. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 prohibited slavery north of 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude. All of this territory was north of that line. Southern senators refused to support organizing territories where slavery was prohibited. They demanded that the territory be open to slavery. Douglas needed to find a way to give the South what it wanted without appearing to betray the Missouri Compromise, which had been sacred sectional law for 34 years. His solution was popular sovereignty. Let the settlers in Kansas and Nebraska vote on whether to allow slavery. Don't decide in Washington. Let democracy work. It sounded reasonable. It was actually arson. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, introduced in January 1854, explicitly repealed the Missouri Compromise prohibition on slavery north of 36 degrees 30 minutes. It organized the Kansas and Nebraska territories under popular sovereignty on the slavery question. The North erupted in fury. The Missouri Compromise had been an inviolable bargain. Northern politicians had accepted slavery's existence in the South in exchange for its exclusion from most Western territories. Douglas was unilaterally breaking a 34-year-old deal. Worse, Kansas bordered Missouri, a slave state. Everyone knew Missouri slaveholders would flood into Kansas to vote for slavery. Popular sovereignty was a transparent fraud designed to expand slavery into territory that had been promised to freedom. Northern Whigs were apoplectic. Their entire remaining identity was built on Clay's compromises and sectional peace. Douglas had just dynamited the most essential compromise. Southern Whigs celebrated. Finally, a new territory opened to slavery. Many had grown weary of defending their Northern Party colleagues anyway. This proved the Democrats were better defenders of Southern interests. The Whig Party couldn't hold both positions. Northern Whigs who supported Kansas-Nebraska would be destroyed electorally. Southern Whigs who opposed it would be destroyed at the polls. The party split geographically and immediately. No middle ground existed. You either supported opening Kansas to slavery or you didn't. Abraham Lincoln, still a Whig in Illinois, said Kansas-Nebraska took us by surprise, astounded us. He'd been semi-retired from politics, focused on his law practice. The act drove him back into political activism, leading him to give speeches denouncing Douglas's betrayal. William Seward, and other Northern Whigs joined with anti-slavery Democrats, Free Soilers, and former Liberty Party members to organize opposition. In July 1854, they met in Jackson, Michigan, and founded the Republican Party, dedicated to a single principle: stopping the expansion of slavery. The Republicans were explicitly sectional. They didn't compete in the South, didn't even try. This was unprecedented. A major party that was purely Northern. Southern Whigs realized their party was collapsing. Some joined the Democrats immediately. Others desperately tried to preserve a national Whig organization. They failed. The 1854 midterm elections were catastrophic for the Whigs. Northern Whigs who supported Kansas, Nebraska lost. Northern Whigs who opposed it lost to Republicans or anti-Nebraska coalitions. Southern Whigs lost to Democrats who questioned their commitment to slavery. The Whigs lost 76 House seats. They went from controlling Congress to irrelevance in a single election. What happened? Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act forced a choice between sectional loyalty and party loyalty. Voters chose the section over the party. Northern voters didn't care about preserving a national party if it meant tolerating slavery expansion. Southern voters didn't care about preserving a national party if it meant accepting Northern criticism of slavery. The Whigs had survived by avoiding that choice. They talked about economics, not slavery. They focused on issues where a North-South compromise was possible. Kansas, Nebraska made slavery the only issue that mattered. And on that issue, no compromise was possible. Douglas had expected mild controversy, followed by acceptance. He got violent opposition and permanent sectional division. His political career was ruined. He'd never win the presidency. His economic ambitions were set back. The railroad eventually went through, but the sectional crisis he'd triggered delayed and complicated it. And he'd accidentally destroyed the Whig Party. The Whigs had required both North and South to maintain national viability. Once Northern voters had an alternative party, Republicans, that didn't require cooperation with slaveholders, Northern Whigs fled en masse. Once Southern voters saw that Northern Whigs were joining anti-slavery parties, Southern Whigs became tainted by association. The party died because its central premise, that North and South could cooperate in a single party, became untenable. Kansas, Nebraska proved sectional identity was stronger than party identity. Given a choice between preserving sectional interests and preserving party unity, Americans chose sectional interests. This was new. In the 1830s and 1840s, party loyalty often trumped sectional loyalty. Northern and Southern Whigs fought together against Northern and Southern Democrats. The party was primary. After 1854, the section was primary. Northern Republicans and Northern Democrats might hate each other, but both were preferable to Southerners. Southern Democrats and Southern Whigs might compete, but both agreed Northerners were the enemy. The two-party system had forced cross-sectional cooperation. Its collapse allowed purely sectional politics. The Whigs lingered for a few more years, but the party was already dead. Kansas, Nebraska was the bullet to the head. What remained was just the body twitching. As the Whig Party collapsed, desperate survivors grabbed onto the strangest lifeboat imaginable. A secretive, xenophobic, conspiracy-minded movement that called itself the American Party, but was better known as the Know-Nothings. The name came from their origins as a secret society. When asked about the organization, members were supposed to reply, "I know nothing." The secrecy was part of the appeal, a political movement that felt like a fraternal lodge, complete with passwords, rituals, and oaths. Their platform was simple. Immigrants, predominantly Irish and German Catholics, were destroying America. This wasn't a fringe position in the 1850s. Immigration had exploded in the previous decade. Between 1845 and 1855, over 3 million immigrants arrived, most fleeing the Irish potato famine and failed European revolutions. In a nation of 23 million, this was a massive demographic change. Many native-born Protestants were terrified. Catholic immigrants were poor, didn't speak English, lived in urban slums, voted in ethnic blocs, usually Democratic, and owed religious allegiance to the Pope. Nativist propaganda claimed Catholics couldn't be loyal Americans because they obeyed a foreign power, the Vatican. Conspiracy theories spread about priests smuggling weapons into churches to arm immigrants for a papal takeover. The Know Nothing movement gained momentum in 1854 to 1855, winning state elections in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and California, and making strong showings across the North. In 1855, they controlled legislatures in multiple states and elected governors, mayors, and members of Congress. Why the sudden success? They filled the vacuum left by the Whig collapse. Former Whigs, especially those uncomfortable with the explicitly anti-slavery Republican Party, needed somewhere to go. The Know-Nothings offered an alternative. Forget about slavery. Unite against the immigrant threat. This was appealing for several reasons. First, avoidance. The slavery question was dividing the country and destroying parties. The Know-Nothings offered Americans another fight to have. Instead of North versus South, it could be native-born versus immigrant. This preserved national unity. Both Northern and Southern native-born Protestants could unite against Catholic immigrants. Second, scapegoating economic anxiety in the 1850s, unemployment, wage pressure, urban crowding, could be blamed on immigrants rather than structural economic forces. This was emotionally satisfying and politically useful. Third, identity politics. The Know-Nothings offered white Protestant Americans a sense of threatened identity requiring defense. This tribal appeal was powerful, especially among working-class voters who felt economically and culturally displaced. Fourth, institutional familiarity. The Know-Nothings had rallies, newspapers, local organizations, all the infrastructure of a political party. Former Whigs could seamlessly transfer their political activity. In 1856, the Know-Nothings nominated former President Millard Fillmore as their candidate. Fillmore had been a Whig president, 1850 to 1853, who'd signed the Fugitive Slave Act and supported the Compromise of 1850. He represented precisely the kind of conservative, unionist, avoid the slavery question politics the Know-Nothings embodied. The 1856 election featured 3 candidates: James Buchanan, Democrat, Northern man with Southern principles, promised to end sectional agitation; John C. Fremont, Republican, Western explorer and anti-slavery advocate, purely sectional candidate; Millard Fillmore, Know-Nothing, Whig, former president, unionist, anti-immigrant. Fillmore's campaign was the Whig Party's death rattle. He ran on the Know-Nothing ticket, but also claimed the Whig nomination. The party was too dead to object. His message: ignore slavery, fear Catholics, preserve the Union through nativist unity. He carried 1 state, Maryland, with 8 electoral votes. Buchanan won with 174 electoral votes. Fremont, the purely Northern, anti-slavery Republican, won 114 electoral votes and 11 states. The Know-Nothing collapse was as rapid as their rise. Why? The slavery question couldn't be avoided. Kansas was literally bleeding. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers were killing each other. You couldn't distract Americans from that with fears about Irish immigrants. Know-Nothings split sectorally. 2 Northern Know-Nothings increasingly opposed slavery expansion. Southern Know-Nothings supported it. The party tried to avoid taking a position, exactly the strategy that had killed the Whigs. By 1856, the same fault line was cracking the Know-Nothings. Bigotry had limited appeal. Anti-immigrant sentiment was genuine, but it wasn't powerful enough to overcome the slavery crisis. When forced to choose between hating immigrants and resolving the slavery question, most Americans chose the latter. Republicans absorbed their base. Northern Know-Nothings realized the Republican Party was more viable. By 1856 to 1857, most Northern Know-Nothings had migrated to the Republicans. The Republicans quietly absorbed Know-Nothing nativism without making it their primary identity. The movement was ridiculous. The secrecy, the rituals, the conspiracy theories, it all seemed increasingly absurd as the nation faced a genuine crisis. Grown men with secret passwords worrying about papal invasion while Kansas burned struck many Americans as childish. By 1858, the Know-Nothing Party was effectively dead. Some Southern remnants persisted, eventually merging into the Constitutional Union Party. But as a national force, they vanished. The Know-Nothing interlude revealed something important about the Whig collapse. There was a genuine appetite for a party that avoided the slavery question. Millions of Americans, North and South, wanted to talk about anything else, but reality wouldn't cooperate. The slavery question was too fundamental, too urgent, too divisive to be ignored or distracted from. The Whigs had avoided it through economic policy focus. The Know-Nothings tried to prevent it through immigrant bashing. Both failed. The only parties that survived were those that took clear positions on slavery. Democrats, defending it, and Republicans, opposing its expansion. The center, the position that said, "Let's not talk about slavery," was gone. The Whigs had occupied that center for 20 years. Their collapse proved the center was no longer viable. For former Whigs, the choice was now binary. Join the Republicans and oppose slavery expansion, or join the Democrats and accept slavery's perpetuation. Many Northern Whigs became Republicans. Many Southern Whigs became Democrats. A handful tried to maintain a unionist, compromise position through the Constitutional Union Party. But the Whig coalition, the idea that North and South could cooperate in a single party by avoiding divisive issues, was dead. And with it died the last political institution that required and rewarded sectional cooperation. The Know-Nothing episode was the final proof that America's political system had broken beyond repair. The Republican Party was born from the Whig Party's corpse, but it was a fundamentally different creature. The Whigs had been a national coalition requiring North-South cooperation. The Republicans were explicitly, unapologetically sectional. They didn't just fail to compete in the South, they didn't try. This was unprecedented and revolutionary. Never before had a major American party been purely regional. The first Republican meeting occurred in Ripon, Wisconsin, in March 1854, just weeks after Stephen Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act. About 50 people gathered in a small schoolhouse to discuss forming a new party dedicated to opposing slavery's expansion. Similar meetings sprouted across the North throughout spring and summer 1854. The organizational meeting that gave the party its name occurred in Jackson, Michigan, in July 1854. Thousands gathered in a grove. No building was large enough to formally establish the Republican Party. Their founding principle was simple: slavery must not expand into Western territories. They didn't demand immediate abolition. That would be too radical for most Northern voters. But they insisted that slavery be contained to where it currently existed, with the expectation that containment would lead to gradual extinction. This position, free soil, free labor, free men, united several constituencies. Former Whigs like William Seward, New York, Salmon Chase, Ohio, and Abraham Lincoln, Illinois, who'd opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act and needed a new political home. Free Soilers who'd been running third-party candidates on anti-slavery platforms for years. Anti-slavery Democrats were disgusted with their party's Southern domination. Abolitionists were willing to accept gradualism if it meant political viability. Working-class Northerners who opposed slavery's expansion, not necessarily from moral conviction, but from economic self-interest. They didn't want to compete with slave labor in Western territories. The coalition was ideologically diverse, ranging from moral absolutists who considered slavery evil to racists who simply didn't want black people enslaved or free in Western territories. But they agreed on the core position: stop the spread of slavery. The 1854 midterm elections were Republicans' first electoral test. Running as anti-Nebraska candidates in many states, they won spectacularly in the Midwest. In Illinois, Lincoln campaigned for Republican candidates, while still technically calling himself a Whig. Anti-Nebraska coalitions won in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. By 1855, Republicans controlled several northern state governments. They were building infrastructure, newspapers, local organizations, patronage networks at remarkable speed. The 1856 presidential election would test whether a purely sectional party could compete nationally. The Republicans nominated John C. Fremont, a Western explorer and son-in-law of Thomas Hart Benton, a prominent Missouri Democrat. Fremont was handsome and famous, with almost no political record, making him a clean slate for Republican messaging. His campaign slogan, "Free soil, free labor, free speech, free men, Fremont." The Republican platform was unambiguous. Congress should prohibit slavery in all territories. Kansas should be admitted as a free state immediately. The Fugitive Slave Act should be repealed. This was radical. No major party had ever run on an explicitly anti-slavery platform. Southern reaction was apocalyptic. Southern newspapers declared that Fremont's election would mean immediate disunion. Georgia's Robert Toombs warned that Fremont's victory would justify secession. Virginia's former governor threatened that the South would resist Republican rule to the last extremity. The Democratic campaign exploited these fears. Their candidate, James Buchanan, ran as the only candidate who could preserve the Union. Vote Republican, Democrats warned, and you're voting for civil war. It worked. Barely. Buchanan won with 174 electoral votes to Fremont's 114. But the results were ominous. Fremont carried 11 states, all northern. He won without a single southern state. He didn't even appear on the ballot in most southern states. He received 33% of the popular vote nationally, but 45% in free states. If Fremont had won Pennsylvania and either Illinois or Indiana, which were close, he would have won the presidency without a single Southern vote. The message was clear. A purely Northern party could win the presidency. The South's influence in presidential elections, which had dominated American politics since Washington, was ending. This terrified the South for good reason. Presidential power included federal appointments, Supreme Court nominations, territorial governance, and military command. A president hostile to slavery could strangle it slowly through federal power, even without congressional cooperation. The Republicans had proven that sectional politics was viable, and in doing so, they'd killed any remaining hope for Whig revival. Because the Whigs had required both sections, their entire model was cross-sectional coalition building. Ambitious Northern Whigs had to moderate on slavery to stay acceptable to Southern Whigs, and vice versa. Republicans didn't need Southern support. Northern Republicans could be as anti-slavery as their constituents wanted. There was no moderating force, no need to compromise with slaveholders. This was liberating for anti-slavery Northerners and terrifying for Southerners. The Whig model, forcing sectional compromise through party structure, was obsolete. Why would a Northern politician join a national party and moderate their anti-slavery position when they could join the Republicans and advocate more aggressively? The answer: they wouldn't. And they didn't. By 1856, virtually every Northern Whig with political ambitions had become a Republican. The Whig Party in the North was empty, just a name on old letterhead. Southern Whigs watched in horror. They'd spent 20 years in coalition with Northerners who at least claimed to respect slavery and sectional peace. Now those same Northerners were joining a party dedicated to slavery's destruction. Some Southern Whigs joined the Democrats, the only remaining national party. Others tried to build constitutional union movements, preserving Whig unionism. A few became early secessionists, arguing that the Republican Party's rise proved the Union was already broken. The Republican success also fundamentally changed American political culture. For the first time, a major party treated an entire section of the country as enemy territory. Republicans didn't campaign in the South, didn't appeal to Southern voters, didn't moderate positions to accommodate Southern sensibilities. They wrote off the South entirely and competed solely for Northern votes. This made sectional conflict inevitable. When political parties spanned sections, they had an incentive to moderate and compromise. When parties became sectional, they had an incentive to radicalize and mobilize. The Republicans' rise was the Whigs' death, and the Whigs' death was the Union's death sentence. It would take 5 more years to execute, but the verdict was already in. By late 1854, the Whig Party was a corpse that hadn't stopped twitching yet. In the North, Whig organizations were dissolving. Meetings couldn't achieve a quorum. State conventions were canceled. Local chapters simply stopped functioning. In the South, Whig leaders were quietly joining the Democratic Party, abandoning their old political home for the party that would defend slavery without apology. Whig voters, millions of them, found themselves politically homeless. They'd voted Whig for 20 years. Their identities were wrapped up in Whig principles: economic development, congressional supremacy, moral reform, and opposition to democratic corruption. Now, their party was dead. Where could they go? Many Northern Whigs would eventually join the new Republican Party. But in 1854 to 55, the Republicans were too radical, too openly anti-slavery for moderate former Whigs. Southern Whigs couldn't join Republicans. The party didn't even exist in the South and was explicitly anti-slavery. Into this vacuum stepped the American Party, popularly known as the Know-Nothings. The name came from their origins as a secret society. When members were asked about the organization, they were instructed to say, "I know nothing." The American Party's platform was simple: nativism. Blame America's problems on immigrants, especially Catholic immigrants from Ireland and Germany. The Know-Nothings claimed that Catholics were loyal to the Pope, not America. That immigrants were stealing jobs from native-born workers. That foreign radicals were corrupting American politics. It was bigotry, paranoid conspiracy theory, scapegoating, and it was politically brilliant for a while. Because nativism was one issue that could unite North and South, both regions had Catholic immigration. Both had nativist sentiment. A party opposing immigration could appeal to both sections without touching the slavery question. For desperate former Whigs, the American Party seemed like a lifeboat. In 1854, Know-Nothing candidates won shocking victories. Massachusetts. Know-Nothings won the governorship and entire state legislature, all but 3 of 378 legislative seats. Delaware. Know-Nothing governor elected Pennsylvania. Know-Nothings won the Philadelphia mayor and major offices, dozens of congressional seats across North and South. By early 1855, the American Party controlled state governments in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Delaware, California, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and had strong showings in Maryland, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Former Whig leaders joined in droves. Millard Fillmore, former Whig president, became the Know-Nothing standard-bearer Kenneth Rayner. North Carolina Whig leader Garrett Davis, Kentucky Whig congressman, dozens of other Whig politicians. For about 18 months, the American Party looked like the Whig Party's successor, a national organization that could compete in both the North and the South, a party that avoided the slavery issue by focusing on immigration. It was an illusion, and it collapsed spectacularly. The problem: you can't escape slavery politics in 1850s America. The issue is too fundamental, too urgent, too morally charged. In June 1855, the Know-Nothing National Council met in Philadelphia to prepare for the 1856 presidential campaign. They needed a platform. Northern delegates wanted a statement opposing the expansion of slavery into territories. Not abolition, just restriction to where it already existed. Southern delegates demanded a plank supporting popular sovereignty, letting territories vote on slavery, or outright protection of slavery in territories. The debate became vicious. Accusations of betrayal, threats of walkouts. The same sectional fury that had destroyed the Whigs was destroying the Know-Nothings. The final platform adopted Section 12, which essentially supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act and popular sovereignty on slavery. 50 Northern delegates walked out in protest. They formed the North Americans, effectively splitting the party. The 1856 presidential campaign revealed the damage. The Know-Nothings nominated Millard Fillmore. He was respected, experienced, moderate, everything the party needed. But he was running on a platform that Northern anti-slavery voters hated and Southern fire-eaters found insufficient. The results were catastrophic. Fillmore won only Maryland, 8 electoral votes. He came in third nationally behind Democrat Buchanan, 174 electoral votes, and Republican Fremont, 114 electoral votes. The Know-Nothings were destroyed as a national party. What went wrong? The same thing that killed the Whigs. The slavery issue couldn't be avoided, evaded, or substituted. Any national party had to take a position. Any position would alienate one section. Northern Know-Nothings looked at the results and realized we can win more by joining the Republicans and explicitly opposing slavery expansion than by trying to maintain a national party that compromises on the issue. Southern Know-Nothings reached the opposite conclusion. The only way to defend slavery is through the Democratic Party, which is unambiguously pro-Southern. By 1857, the American Party was functionally dead. Some remnants persisted. Fillmore was their last presidential candidate in 1856. A few congressmen still used the label, but as a national force, they were finished. The Know-Nothing moment, that brief window when it seemed nativism could replace Whig nationalism, was over. The lesson was clear and ominous. National political parties were no longer viable. The country was too divided. Slavery was too central. Compromise was impossible. Former Whigs had to choose: join a purely Northern anti-slavery party, Republicans, or a pro-Southern slavery defending party, Democrats. There was no middle ground left, no national party, no compromise position. The political system that had held the country together for 70 years, two national parties competing for both Northern and Southern votes, forced to moderate and compromise to build coalitions, was dead. What replaced it was something America had never seen: sectional parties that didn't need votes from the other region and therefore had no incentive to compromise. The Northern Whigs, who'd spent the last 2 years desperately trying to avoid the Republican Party, finally accepted the inevitable. By 1856, the Republican Party was absorbing former Northern Whigs en masse, and in doing so, they were creating the political structure that would tear the nation apart. The Republican Party was born explicitly as a sectional party, not accidentally, not reluctantly, by design. In February 1854, even before the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, anti-slavery activists were planning. If Douglas's bill became law and opened territories to slavery, they would form a new party dedicated to one principle: stopping slavery's expansion. The first organizational meetings were held in Ripon, Wisconsin, March 20, 1854, and Jackson, Michigan, July 6, 1854. The name Republican was deliberately chosen to evoke Thomas Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party and its commitment to Republican government. But this wasn't Jefferson's party. His party had been national, even dominant in the South. The new Republican Party was explicitly Northern. It didn't even try to organize in the slave states. Its founding principle, stopping slavery expansion, guaranteed it would win zero Southern support. The founders didn't care. They'd watched the Whigs die trying to maintain North-South unity. The Republicans would try something different: build a purely Northern coalition strong enough to win the presidency without a single Southern vote. The math worked. The North had more people, more electoral votes. A party that swept the free states could win the White House while losing every slave state. It had never been attempted before. It violated every assumption of American politics. It was radical, dangerous, and possibly treasonous by Southern standards. It was also the future. The Republicans absorbed former Northern Whigs in massive numbers. Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, Whig congressman, and Clay Devotee joined Republicans in 1856. New York, William Seward, Whig senator and governor, became the Republican leader. Ohio, Salmon P. Chase, a former Whig, became a Republican governor and then a senator. Dozens of Whig members of Congress, state legislators, and local officials switched parties. The Northern Whig apparatus, newspapers, donors, organizers, flowed into the Republican Party. But Republicans weren't just Whigs rebranded. They also absorbed Free Soil Party members, opposed slavery expansion, anti-slavery Democrats, barn burners who'd left over slavery, know-nothings who prioritized anti-slavery over nativism, abolitionists who'd previously avoided politics. A single issue united this coalition: slavery must not expand. Beyond that, they disagreed on everything: tariffs, banking, immigration, and temperance. But unlike the Whigs, who'd tried to avoid slavery discussion, Republicans made it central. They had clarity, focus, moral certainty. The 1856 presidential campaign was their test. Republicans nominated John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, Western explorer, California Gold Rush hero, son-in-law of Missouri, Senator Thomas Hart Benton. He was young, 43, dynamic, and romantic. His qualification for the presidency: basically, none. He'd never held elected office and had limited political experience. Was chosen entirely for the image, just like the Whigs' old strategy of nominating war heroes, but this time with an anti-slavery platform. The Republican platform was direct: oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act ban slavery from all territories, admit Kansas as a free state, support internal improvements, and the Transcontinental Railroad. The campaign slogan: free soil, free labor, free speech, free men, Fremont. Southern response was immediate and apocalyptic. If Fremont had won, they would have seceded immediately. Jefferson Davis, Mississippi senator, declared the election of Fremont would be the end of the Union. Southern states began organizing militias. Secession conventions were planned in the event of a Republican victory. This wasn't bluster. The South genuinely believed a Republican administration would destroy slavery. If not immediately, then eventually. A purely Northern party in control of federal power was the nightmare scenario. The results: Democrat James Buchanan, 174 electoral votes, 14 slave states plus 5 free states. Republican Fremont, 114 electoral votes, 11 free states. Know Nothing, Fillmore, 8 electoral votes, Maryland only. Fremont lost. But the numbers were terrifying to the South. Fremont had won 11 of 16 free states. If Republicans won Pennsylvania and either Illinois or Indiana in 1860, they'd win the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. A party would rule the South they didn't elect, couldn't influence, and believed wanted to destroy their society. Southern Whigs watched in horror. The political system they'd helped build, national parties requiring North-South coalitions, was dead. The Republican victory proved you could compete for the presidency while treating the South as enemy territory. The last Southern Whigs abandoned ship. In Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Maryland, the final Whig strongholds, former Whig leaders became Democrats or formed the Constitutional Union Party, a last-ditch effort at a national compromise party. By 1858, the Whig Party existed in name only. A few old-timers still called themselves Whigs. Some local offices still had Whig affiliations, but as a national organization, it no longer existed. The 1860 election would complete the transition. Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln, a former Whig congressman from Illinois, known for debates with Stephen Douglas over Kansas and the expansion of slavery. Lincoln was moderate by Republican standards. He didn't call for abolition. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed. He just opposed its expansion. But that was radical enough. Stopping slavery expansion meant slavery would eventually die economically, strangled by free state growth. The Democrats, meanwhile, split into Northern, Stephen Douglas, and Southern, John C. Breckinridge factions. The Constitutional Union Party, old Whigs, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Lincoln won with 40% of the popular vote, but 180 of 303 electoral votes. He won every free state except New Jersey. Split. He won 0 slave states. Wasn't even on the ballot in most of them. The thing Whigs had spent 20 years preventing had happened. A purely sectional party had won the presidency. The Republican Party, offspring of the Whig collapse, had succeeded by abandoning the Whig strategy of national compromise. But success came at a price. 7 Southern states seceded before Lincoln even took office. The political system had fractured along the same lines that the nation would fracture. And the Whig Party, which had held North and South together through sheer force of compromise, wasn't there to stop it, because it was dead. The Whig Party's death changed more than party labels. It changed the fundamental structure of American politics in a way that made civil war almost inevitable. To understand how, we need to understand what the two-party system has been. The second party system, 1828 to 1854. Democrats versus Whigs. Both parties competed nationally. Both needed votes from both the North and the South to win. Both had to compromise on slavery to maintain their coalitions. This forced moderation. A Southern Democrat couldn't be too radical on slavery, or he'd lose Northern Democratic votes. A Northern Whig couldn't be too anti-slavery, or he'd lose Southern Whig support. The system was frustrating. It prevented clear positions. It rewarded vague platforms and evasion, but it held the country together. Because as long as both parties were national, both parties had an incentive to prevent sectional rupture. Secession would destroy their cross-sectional coalitions. The Whig collapse destroyed this structure. The third-party system, 1854 to 1861, Republicans, Northern only, versus Democrats, increasingly Southern-dominated. Republicans didn't need Southern votes. They could win the presidency with just the North. Therefore, they had no incentive to moderate for Southern sensibilities. Democrats didn't need anti-slavery Northern votes. They could win with the South, Northern cities, and immigrants. Therefore, they had no incentive to restrict slavery. The parties stopped overlapping. They became sectional. And sectional parties don't compromise. They fight. The 1860 election demonstrated the disaster perfectly. 4 candidates: Abraham Lincoln, Republican, won 180 electoral votes from 17 free states and 1 slave state, Missouri. Won 0 electoral votes from 14 slave states. Wasn't on the ballot in 10 southern states. John C. Breckinridge, Southern Democrat, won 72 electoral votes from 11 slave states. Won 0 free states. John Bell, Constitutional Union, Old Whigs, won 39 electoral votes from 3 border states, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia. Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat, won 12 electoral votes, Missouri plus New Jersey split. Despite winning 30% of the popular vote nationwide, he won almost no electoral votes because his support was geographically diffuse. The results showed a nation completely divided geographically. Lincoln swept the North. Breckinridge swept the Deep South. Bell won the border. Douglas won nothing. There was no national coalition, no party that united North and South, no political mechanism forcing compromise. When Lincoln won, the South faced a new reality. They were ruled by a party they hadn't elected, couldn't influence through everyday politics, and believed was dedicated to their destruction. Under the old Whig Democrat system, this couldn't have happened. Any winning party needed Southern votes, so the South had leverage. Southern Whigs could threaten to vote Democratic if Northern Whigs went too far on slavery. Southern Democrats could threaten to vote Whig if Northern Democrats betrayed slavery interests. This gave the South veto power. Not formal, but practical. The Republican system destroyed that veto. Lincoln didn't need the South. His coalition was purely Northern. He owed the South nothing. From the Southern perspective, this was tyranny. The majority imposes its will on the minority without the minority's consent. South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860. Their secession declaration cited the Republican victory explicitly. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed by February 1st, 1861. They formed the Confederate States of America, elected Jefferson Davis president, and prepared for war. The question, could the Whig Party have prevented this? Probably not. The sectional conflict over slavery was too deep. The economic and moral divisions are too fundamental. Eventually, the issue would have to be resolved. But the Whig collapse removed the last institutional break on rupture. As long as Whigs existed, Southern politicians had a reason to compromise, maintain their coalition with Northern Whigs. Northern politicians had a reason to moderate, keep Southern Whigs in the party. The Whig Party was a cross-sectional conversation that never stopped. Sometimes it was productive. Often it was frustrating. It always required both sides to talk to each other. When the Whigs died, that conversation ended. Republicans and Southern Democrats didn't talk to each other, didn't negotiate, didn't compromise. They saw each other as enemies, not coalition partners. Republicans believed the South was a backward, immoral society built on slavery that must be contained. Southern Democrats believed the North was a tyrannical, fanatical society that wanted to destroy Southern civilization. Neither side was entirely wrong. Neither could compromise without betraying their core principles. The Whig Party had been the institution that forced them to try anyway. That required politicians to work across sectional lines. That punished extremism and rewarded moderation. Its collapse left nothing but extremism. Could another national party have replaced the Whigs? The Know-Nothings tried and failed. The Constitutional Union Party attempted to win in 1860, but won only 3 states. The truth, by the 1850s, slavery was too central to American politics to allow cross-sectional parties. Any party had to take a position. Any position alienated one section. The Whigs died because they couldn't resolve this contradiction. No party could, but their death accelerated the crisis. It removed the last institutional mechanism forcing North and South to cooperate politically. When Fort Sumter was fired upon on April 12, 1861, it wasn't just states going to war. It was political parties completing what they'd started. The complete separation of North and South into hostile camps that shared nothing but geography. The Civil War killed 620,000 Americans. It destroyed Southern infrastructure. It ended slavery. It transformed the federal government. It created the modern United States. But it began with the death of a political party. The Whigs rose to unite a divided nation through compromise, economic development, and moral purpose. They fell because the divisions became too deep to bridge. And when they fell, they took the last chance for peaceful resolution with them. The war that followed wasn't just military. It was the final collapse of the political system the Whigs had helped build. A system where North and South talked, negotiated, and compromised. Replaced by a system where they fought, killed, and died. Because when political parties become sectional, nations become sectional. And sectional nations don't survive. They split and bleed.